Well, welcome back to our second lesson on behaviorism. Quick couple of questions for you. Can you tell me what tabula rasa means? And can you tell me what we mean by environmental determinism? The behaviorist approach is about learning stuff from the environment. And the second assumption that we're going to look at in a minute is about how that learning actually happens. Okay, so in this lesson, you need to understand this idea that says that behavior is learned through conditioning. You need to know what conditioning means. It's very straightforward, but I'll spell it out. We're going to look at one type of conditioning today called classical conditioning. And there are 3 stages to that, and you need to know the 3 stages, and you need to be able to use the technical terms that go along with that. And then again, you need to have completed pages 2 to 4 in your handout, and then copied them into your electronic exercise book. Okay, so let's push on. Give yourself a minute, pause the video for a minute and think, okay, he's just showed me a list of lesson objectives in the lesson focus. What's he likely to ask me if we were in class? What would he ask me at the end of the lesson? And what would he ask me at the beginning of the next lesson to check that I'd done some review of this material? Okay, so write them questions down. Pause and write those questions down. I'll let you do it for a minute, but I'll carry on. We looked at this. This was in the handout for the last lesson, and I didn't really spell it out, but I think it's important that to realize that what behaviorists believe about learning is it's about making connections between things. It's between making a connection between something that happens in the environment and your response. And learning means connecting those 2 things. Yeah. So if you stand at traffic lights and you go to cross when the light is red, you might notice cars screeching to a halt and shouting at you, or you might have to jump out of the way of a moving car. And so you learn to connect seeing a red light with stopping and letting the traffic go past and then waiting for a green light to happen. Okay, so learning is about making these stimulus response connections. Okay, so that's really important when we come on to conditioning. Yeah, so a stimulus is something that happens to you or that happens in the environment, and the response is what you do as a result of that. Okay, so they argue that all behavior is learned through conditioning, and there are 2 mechanisms, 2 ways of conditioning, and they are called classical and operant. Now, one of the objectives was to say, what do we mean by conditioning? And it really kind of means training. I think that for most of the time, that's a good word to use. So if you think someone's learned to do something, for behaviorists, that means they've been trained to do it by the environment. Okay, so if you make that connection between learning and training, conditioning and training, then you won't go far wrong. Okay. So if we think of classical conditioning first, we can think of this kind of slightly rude way of remembering, which is to think as. Okay, so we think classical conditioning, and classical conditioning is learning through association, through making connections. Okay, so you may have noticed, your dog's making connections. So you may notice that when you pick your dog's lead up to go for a walk, the dog follows you out the door. Or when you rattle your cat's food tin or food bowl, it comes ready to get fed. So they've made an association. An association is just a connection. They've made a connection between a noise or someone picking up a lead and a behavior. Okay, and that's what learning is, for behaviorists at least. So every time I played an Elvis song, I hit you, you might start feeling a bit nervous when Elvis came on the what do you call that thing? What do you call them now? Not CD players anymore, are they? You know, smart speakers, whatever, you modern people. Anyway, Here's an interesting film of some original footage of the guy who discovered this process of classical conditioning, and you may have heard of him. Very famous psychologist called Ivan Pavlov, who did quite a lot of experimental work with dogs. And here's some useful footage.
Behavioral psychologists have come up with new views, not only of animal behavior, but of human nature as well. And these views all concern a process that we take for granted, learning, because we are all truly born to learn. Ironically, one of the most important figures in the study of learning, Ivan Pavlov, wasn't concerned with the subject at all, at least not at first. Pavlov, a noted Russian scientist, won the Nobel Prize for Physiology and Medicine in 1904. As this original footage shows, Pavlov was initially interested in digestion and the action of the salivary glands. By diverting the saliva of dogs into test tubes, he could precisely measure if and how much they salivated during digestion. When food was presented, the dog salivated quickly, an inherited salivary reflex. But over repeated testings, a strange thing happened. The dog salivated before contact with the food. Just the sight of the food was enough to stimulate their drooling. Then, just seeing the food dish, or even hearing the footsteps of Pavlov or his assistants, was enough to trigger this built-in reflex. What was going on to elicit this response? Pavlov decided to find out by systematically varying the stimuli and measuring the dog's reaction. Metronomes, lights, and bells were all used as stimuli, and they all worked as stand-ins for the food. What mattered was not the kind of stimulus that was used, but the fact that it reliably signaled that food was on the way. Pavlov had discovered a fundamental type of learning called classical conditioning. An original stimulus elicits an automatic unlearned response. Both stimulus and response happen naturally. They are unconditioned.
I'll just reinforce that there. So giving a dog food, that's a natural thing. And the dog's response to salivate is a natural thing. The dog doesn't have to be trained to salivate. Okay, when it sees food, when a dog sees food, it will salivate. There's no training involved. That just happens. So that's the first. That's going to be the first part of the conditioning process. Yeah. So we've got an unconditioned stimulus, the food, no training involved. Unconditioned response, salivating when it sees food, no training involved.
Then a second, neutral stimulus that never elicits the unconditioned response by itself is introduced just before the presentation of the original stimulus. If the neutral or signaling stimulus is presented alone, and a response occurs as if the original stimulus were still there, we say that conditioning has taken place. The arbitrary neutral stimulus becomes a conditioned stimulus. The reverse is also true. Pavlov and others studied the extinction over time of such conditioned responses. When the subject learns that the conditioned stimulus no longer signals a desired event, the acquisition process is reversed, as the learned connection is gradually weakened. Pavlov's work and the work of those who followed him led to a remarkable conclusion, and that is any stimulus an organism can perceive is capable of eliciting any reaction the organism is capable of making. This means that virtually any sound, sight, or smell can influence the way our muscles tense or relax, our moods fluctuate, or even the way our attitudes are formed. For instance, if I say, relax, and then do this, you're going to be startled and upset. After 5 or 6 pairings of relax, just saying the word relax is going to generate a negative response rather than its usual learned reaction.
So there we have, and what that psychologist called, the guy with the beard, Zimbardo, another very famous psychologist, was explaining there, was the 3 stages of the classical conditioning process. So we have stage 1, which is before conditioning. So we have, as we said, we have an unconditioned stimulus, the food, and an unconditioned response to salivation. Yeah, we don't need to train the dog to salivate when it sees food. And also at this stage, before we do any conditioning, if we showed a dog, if we played a metronome to a dog, oops. If we showed a metronome to a dog, it wouldn't respond. It wouldn't produce saliva because it hasn't got that connection. Okay, so in the stage 1 before conditioning, we've got an unconditioned stimulus and we've got a neutral stimulus. The unconditioned stimulus produces the salivation. The neutral stimulus doesn't get any response at all as far as salivation goes. Okay, stage 2, during condition, we combine those two. We associate the unconditioned stimulus. We make a connection between the food and the metronome. So as we saw in the film, that Pavlov would play the metronome and then give the dog the food, and the dog would salivate. Now in this stage, what we see here is that the response of the dog is still an unconditioned response because we have an unconditioned stimulus present. Yeah. So even though we've got a metronome there, the dog is salivating because it's aware of the food. Then we get to stage 3 though, and if the dog has made that connection over enough trials, if it keeps happening that we have the food and the metronome, we get to a situation where the dog salivates just by hearing the metronome. Now, what that means is the dog has now been conditioned or trained, because we were going to make that connection between conditioning and training. The dog has now been conditioned or trained to salivate whenever it hears a metronome. So the metronome now is what we call a conditioned stimulus because there's been training involved, and the response is also conditioned because the dog has now been trained to salivate at something which it didn't used to salivate at. It's now salivating at a metronome, and that's, if you like, that's not particularly natural, is it? Okay, so those are the 3 stages of the conditioning process. So what I would like you to do now is to have a go at this particular scenario. So you eat a banana and shortly afterwards you are sick. You are sick not because of the banana, because you've got a stomach bug. However, from now on, the smell and the taste of the bananas makes you feel nauseous, makes you feel like you want to be sick. Okay. So what you need to do here is you need to write down the 3 stages of the conditioning process: before conditioning, during conditioning, after conditioning. And you need to be able to explain why it is at the end that the smell and taste of bananas makes you feel nauseous. Okay. So it would be good for you to identify what the unconditioned stimulus is, what the unconditioned response is. No training involved, don't forget. And then figure out what the neutral stimulus is. And then as a result of those things, if you can work those out, then you should be able to get to the final stage and figure out how that someone feels sick, which is not a natural response, when they smell or taste bananas. Okay, that is the material that you need in order to fill in the next couple of pages, and that's to do with conditioning, classical conditioning, that learning through association. Nice speaking to you, and I'll see you in the next video.